I want to continue our discussion of apartheid policies today. First, looking at education. Uh, as we said in earlier classes, education for Black Africans was carried out mostly by missionary societies previous to the imposition of apartheid. Under apartheid, though, the government seized control of all education, including education for Black Africans. In 1953, the government issued, or rather passed a law called the Bantu Education Act, which placed all schools under the control of the government. And through this process, they ended up transforming what had been very productive educational institutions into institutions that supported the goals of the government. A good example is the University of Fort Hare, or the South African Natives College, as it was called. This was run by a missionary society. It welcomed people from all different backgrounds, all different ethnicities. Fort Hare was turned into, actually, when the government took control of Fort Hare, they fired many of the progressive faculty members and the principal, and they turned it into a school only for Xhosa people. And given that it was in the Ciskei, in a Xhosa area. And so this institution that had educated, not only a lot of South African black leaders, but also many who became leaders of other countries, Jomo Kenyatta and Julius Nyerere, and anyway, several leaders who would become presidents or prime ministers of other newly independent African nations no longer had the opportunity to, people like that no longer had the opportunity to be educated at Fort Hare. It was only for Xhosa. Schools did expand under the government, but the education was very limited. Conditions in black schools were very poor. The number of students per classroom was gigantic, like 40 or 50 per classroom. And these were in dilapidated buildings. The teachers were given inadequate resources. And moreover, the content of the education was made to serve the apartheid state. And we don't have any materials assigned for this class that demonstrate this, but these kids would be given books with pictures and like reading books and things that would have examples like work on your English with this sentence. That is a lazy Kaffir, or the Kaffir stole this loaf of bread, or something like that, right? And so they reinforced the insults and the racial discrimination. And also reinforced the notion that the Afrikaners were this great historic race who had done incredible things and deserved the position that they were in. And this is the kind of education that was fed to the white population, but also to the blacks. So all of that reinforcing apartheid, right? So not only were the conditions horrible, the content itself was highly Eurocentric and often just terribly insulting and oppressive to the black people. Higher education in South Africa under apartheid was some of the best in the world, but it was only offered to, well, not only, but the vast majority of all the students in higher education institutions were white. There were parallel white schools and universities. So there would be English-speaking schools, and then there would be Afrikaans medium schools. There were English universities, English medium universities, and Afrikaans medium universities. All of them very well funded, all of them highly productive. The Afrikaans medium universities did not allow any black students or any students who were non-white at all. A few of the English medium universities, the University of Cape Town, the University of the Witwatersrand, University of Natal, did admit some black students. Some of them in integrated classrooms. Both Cape Town and Wits had integrated classrooms. The University of Natal had a higher percentage of black students than any other university, but the black students were taught in segregated classrooms there, and the education for them was of a lower quality, right? And all, I mean, all of this, the funding gap was just tremendous. The government spent something like 10 times the amount to educate a white student as it did a black student. And that gap would eventually narrow at least a little bit, but it never reached anything approaching equality. Education would become an important source of protest, and we'll see that in 1976, for instance, this inspires the Soweto Uprising, which is a harbinger of things to come, and really sends the apartheid state into crisis, which it was in for the last decade or more of its existence. Much like the Jim Crow laws in the southern United States, South African society was highly segregated. And signs like the one on the slide here were common. Certain areas were declared white-only zones. If black people entered them, they could be killed with impunity. And the government would not interfere with that. One of the kind of components of apartheid that I think is not often talked about is that, many, maybe most white families had dogs, and these dogs were trained to attack people with dark skin. I saw this living in South Africa myself. I knew a family, for instance, a white family who had these dogs, and one of them was like a bull mastiff, and the other one was a Rottweiler, and these were gigantic dogs, ferocious creatures. And I visited this family frequently. Their children played with these dogs. The dogs were very gentle with the children. But one day, a black woman who I also knew was visited this family, and this was an arranged thing. They told her to come, but they weren't there, I guess, and these dogs got out and attacked her and put her in the hospital, right? Because they were trained to attack a black person on sight, and so this thing on the slide where it says "savage dogs devour the corpse," I completely believe that, right? Because these dogs were trained to kill. That's just another thing that adds to the oppression and to the segregation. The next slide has a number of pictures that show the segregated environment, and this was everywhere in South Africa. This was not a specific region like it was in the United States. Just about every social space that could be segregated was segregated. Bathrooms, you can see beaches here, there's a train platform, even areas for sort of standing and waiting for things, were designated as a white-only zone or as a non-white only zone. And of course, the facilities offered to non-whites were of a much lower quality, often broken, subpar, uncomfortable, and it was the inequality of the races was driven home tremendously by the segregation signs. Media was an important factor in apartheid as well. The government put into place laws that allowed for the strict control of media. The South African Broadcasting Corporation, which went into operation in the 1970s, was strictly controlled by the government. All of the content passed government censors, and it had a monopoly on television and radio. And so everything that went out over the airwaves reinforced apartheid. And both black and white residents of South Africa, if they tuned into any media, would see stories, television programs, newscasts, whatever, that reinforced the rightness of apartheid, that talked about the correctness of the kind of society they lived in. Whites, I think Thompson wrote in our textbook that whites from the cradle to the grave were exposed to nothing other than the government line on how society ought to operate. And the media was a big part of this. Even, I mean, in books and newspapers and comic books and, children's readers and other things, apartheid society was the the background for all of that. A number of political measures made it possible for the apartheid state to act very much as a police state, to severely limit any black political organization, non-white political activity of any kind. And some of this was done with a more international audience in mind. For instance, in 1950, and this is, I think, an auspicious date. This is the beginning of the Korean War. This is, the time when the scare over the spread of international communism was at its height. The South African government decreed or passed a law called the Suppression of Communism Act, which declared a strict prohibition on any organization, any rhetoric, any conversation that had anything to do with communism. And over time, the label communism came to be used very liberally, very freely. Just about any organization that was seen as unfriendly or challenging the white government, they could figure out how to label them as communist. So the African National Congress, the Pan-African Congress, the trade unions, the United Democratic Front, every one of these organizations that was formed to represent the interests of the non-white community was labeled communist. And the Suppression of Communism Act gave them wide latitude to do this. There is a document in the Williams book. This is part 4, section B, document 9, starting on page 286. You can see the effects of this anti-communist rhetoric here. There's a fellow named Masabalala Yengwa, who was part of the African National Congress Youth League, which had been decreed illegal as an organization at this point. But he is being interviewed here after his arrest, and if you look, and I'm not going to take time to go through this. I mean, I've myself underlined many sections of this. They keep questioning him on his rhetoric, right? Trying to catch him saying something that sounds like communism, right? So the very beginning, for instance, his this is a trial, so this is the prosecutor, Mr. Tringove. Says, how much land held by Europeans at the moment would have been expropriated or confiscated in terms of this clause in the Freedom Charter? Now, the Freedom Charter is another document that I want to take a look at. I'll do that in a later lecture. But the clause that he's talking about has to do with dividing up the land of South Africa among all of its people equally, right? And this was the clause in the Freedom Charter, which was the kind of founding document of the ANC, not the founding, but the key document stating the goals of the African National Congress. The government seized upon those parts of the Freedom Charter that sounded communist to drive home the idea that the ANC was a communist organization. And that's what's happening to Masabalala Yengwa in this trial, right? So that clause, and Yengwa actually does a really good job, like avoiding this and saying, "Look, I'm not a communist, right? This is not what we're after." And they keep questioning him about this. On page 288, in the middle of the page, Mr. Tringove says, "Mr. Yengwa, apart from Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, have you read any other works on communism?" And Yang was like, "I haven't read anything on communism." right? No other works. No, my lord. And what did you mean when you said in your evidence you don't understand the communist theory of revolution? Well, I meant, my lord, that I have not read any particular, I've not read about the theory of revolution. I cannot tell you exactly the salient points and the salient features of communist theory of revolution. And Trengove says, Mr. Yangui, you know very well that the communists throughout the world are there to overthrow the existing social conditions in non-communist countries by force, by violence. You know that. Well, my lords, I do not know. I don't know the whole history of communism. I'm not able to say that I know. And and he's like, there may be some communists in the movement for liberation in South Africa, but I'm not one of them, and this is not who we are. But with the Suppression of Communism Act, they were able to make any organization that was fomenting for reform or change into a communist organization. And for the international community, the National Party government was able to pitch, their oppressive measures as fighting against the forces of communism. And the United States, for whom that was the central concern of the Cold War, bought this and for the most part allowed the South African government to continue doing what it was doing. I'm not going to go through all of these laws listed on this. Suffice it to say that these gave the government, gave organs of the government, like the police and the military, broad latitude to function without oversight, to do whatever was necessary to suppress any organization that rebelled against the government, right? And to keep them from assembling, to keep them from meeting together, to keep them from forming any kind of mass or momentum that would allow them to oppose the government in any fashion that was productive, right? The Unlawful Organizations Act of 1960, for instance, essentially decreed that any organization opposed to the government was illegal. And moreover, many of these laws contained clauses that prohibited the judicial branch of government, the courts, from having any oversight of government, police, or military activities. And so South Africa became essentially a police state, at least by the 1970s. There was a security branch of the police that was imbued or endowed with wide latitude to function in whatever way necessary to stop rebellious organizations, to stop liberation movements. This would include arresting people without any charge and holding them for indefinite periods and using torture and other tactics to try to get them to confess and to rat out any of their co-conspirators. The police and the military were well-known organizations and well-respected, partly because by the 1970s there was a mandatory conscription of all young white males. Everyone had to serve at least 2 years in the South African Army. And so, they in the Army, more than any other organization, probably drove home the propaganda of apartheid and this notion that blacks were all communists and terrorists. And so this just reinforced the message of apartheid, maybe more than anything else. The South African Army was well funded and well supplied with weapons. This despite a mandatory arms embargo on trading any weapons with South Africa that was put into place in 1977 by the United Nations. Many countries, including the United States, paid no attention to that arms embargo and continued to trade with the South Africans to give them weapons. And so, the police state and the military operated with the latest technology, maybe not the latest technology, but very advanced weapons. And one example of this that I saw when I was living in South Africa in the 1990s is the vehicle pictured on the slide here. This is called a Casper. It's an armored vehicle. It was used by the police to intimidate, and these things, drove through the streets of all of the townships that I worked in, and really, I mean, it's like overkill, right? This had cannons, I believe, could be mounted to it. I mean, it's a bulletproof vehicle, so the police could ride around without any fear of being attacked by small arms. And this was used to intimidate people into submission. Okay, so those, I mean, there's more that we could talk about in terms of apartheid policies, but I think that I hope anyway that this drives home the message about how oppressive and how comprehensive the apartheid system was. And we will look at the effects on South African society and resistance against apartheid in the next lectures.